Welcome, everybody, to the October Carrier's Edge webinar. I'm Mark Morrell, President of Carrier's Edge, and I am joined today by one of my favorite people in the industry to talk to, the one and only Rolf VanderZwaag from Techni-Com. Many of you on this webinar already know Rolf, so that's good. Really doesn't need that much of an introduction. One of the most informed, deeply researched, and expert people in the industry on many technical subjects. And today we're going to dig into air brakes. Thanks, Rolf, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right. We're going to talk about air brakes for a couple of reasons. And part of this is stemming from the fact that we just released a new series of air brake courses in our library. And those courses were based on content that came from CVSA, but also a fair bit of content that came from your Practical Air Brakes Handbook. Um, Air brakes is an interesting topic in that it's always at the top of the list of defects. Anytime there's a road check, anytime there's some blitz, it's always air brakes issues. And it has been thus for many, many, many years now. Pretty much, I don't know, as long as I've been in this industry, I've been hearing about it. I think one of the first industry events I went to, people were talking about push rods and slack adjusters and how drivers don't know what they're doing, and there's all these problems. And it hasn't really gotten that much better. So that tells us that there's something that drivers aren't really getting, something that carriers are not focusing on. And usually when that happens, there's something else behind it. So that's what we want to get to today. Um, and as we were prepping for this, we were talking about some of the different elements of air brakes and some of the issues related to it. And you sent me some information, so I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the scope of the problem because you had sent me a couple of really interesting things. And the first one I want to talk about that I think really nicely underscores the scope of the issue here is a survey of drivers. And you described the performance as staggeringly bad in terms of how people understand air brakes. So let's start with that. Let's sort of tell everybody a little bit about this survey, sort of what you went through and what you found when you were going through this.
All right. Let me preface that with kind of a landscape sort of explanation first. The landscape is different between Canada and the U.S. in that the air brake training, the air brake knowledge is a component of the CDL in the U.S. Licensing scheme. And in Canada, it's a separate endorsement in all of the provinces and territories. So we tend to have more focus and more depth to the air brake component of what drivers need to learn here in Canada. So we are often finding ourselves in a position of leading and having slightly better stats um, and whatnot. So that's a sort of a background kind of perspective. The Operation Airbrake Survey, I did a lot of work with CVSA over the years and their Operation Airbrake Committee. And one of the things that we decided to do was to explore a little bit more the lack of knowledge that exists among drivers, particularly as it relates to those things that show up so often in the on-road inspection activities and the stats that they generate, focusing mainly on brake adjustment, for example, which is, the most critical aspect of can you stop or not. We did that survey back in 2003. It hasn't been updated since then. I think the numbers are probably still going to be similar if we were to do this 20 years later. But in 2003, we basically developed a 12-question survey with sub-questions in them about brake adjustment, its relevance to operating conditions, how you check it properly, the actual conditions under which you would do a proper check of it, consistent with what CVSA does on their roadside inspections, for example. So lots of drivers are getting exposed to that activity there. And we had a pretty well-organized initiative, and we actually developed over 4,000 surveys from drivers. And of that 4,000, 15 drivers answered the questions properly. So that's 0.37% of, and that's all the questions. We broke it down more, but it's a pretty shocking result. And for those that are interested, we are going to provide a link to that report. It's about I think, 20-page with all the sub questions, the actual survey, what kinds of questions we asked, why we asked them, why they were important. That sort of thing is all in that report, so that others
Mhm.
may find it very interesting.
So just on that, yes, we are going to have a link to that we will provide probably in the wrap up after this, where we've got some handouts for everybody. That's a great place for carriers to be starting in terms of assessing driver knowledge and sort of to figure out where you need to be putting a little bit more attention. But yeah, that's not what you would call a strongly positive response if it's such a small number of people that actually got all of the questions right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you also had a sort of a white paper that was breaking out all of the problems with the educational materials or the different handbooks. I thought that was really fascinating as well. And sort of that's a white paper that I know we've got on your website that we're going to share a link with as well. That kind of breaks down all of the different handbooks, and so there were some common things that you found there. And can you give everybody a bit of a summary of some of the issues there?
Yeah, as a follow-up to the fact that we established that, hey, it's a large compliance problem. B, that compliance problem is rooted in lack of knowledge. Independently, I had some time on my hands, and I said, let's take a look at those sources. So getting back to what I said earlier about, we have a different approach in the US and Canada, where in the US it's very centralized. There's the AMBA CDL handbook that the states follow. In Canada, I've claimed we have a deeper delivery of air brake knowledge. Um, but when you get beyond that, there's still a lot of things that are disturbing. Incorrect technical information, common misconceptions that exist. And what I did was I looked at the kind of the evolution of the training programs in Canada. There was sort of a common thread, and then that thread split into a couple of different branches, and they went different ways, and even those branches have continued to evolve. But the fundamental the theme of that paper is that if we want to improve compliance rates, we've got to improve the education materials. And I did break down specifically each one of the kind of the source handbook documents, which is where the training comes from, which would then also develop into instructor materials and whatnot. But the core message is in the handbook, and there's a lot of problem areas, and more than just problem areas. Why isn't there just one message? Why aren't we all teaching the same thing? Technically, it's the same.
Hmm.
And let's establish what we need to have, what we need to include, and then deliver that. Why do we have old material that's 25 years out of date and whatnot still being taught in those programs? Those are questions that I ask, and that's outlined in that paper. We don't have any solutions per se. There is a kind of a standardized curriculum framework that we could be using as a model, but it hasn't been picked up yet by the jurisdictions to go forward with.
So one of the things that stuck out for me when I was reading through that white paper is a real disconnect in who was writing it and who the audience was. And I think what we're talking about today is sort of air brakes in the context of the driver out on the road, what the driver needs to be aware of and responsible for, and how they should be approaching it, versus the person who's repairing those brakes or doing the actual work on the truck. And one of the things that you noted that was sort of common across all of these handbooks is that they seem to be written by subject matter experts that were more on the maintenance side. So you've got sort of a cutaway view of an air brake, and you've got all of these detailed diagrams that really aren't things that drivers are ever going to interact with. So it seems like there's a real disconnect there in the how the material is presented and the audience that is being given this material and what they're actually going to see. Like they're not going to see the inside of a brake, so why show that to them or why focus on that so much? I thought that was really interesting. Is that something that you see as still a challenge, is still an issue in the material?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know how much has changed in any of the provincial programs, which obviously, because we have many more provincial programs, it's heavily weighted in covering those things because of the differences. It's easier to address the US when you have just a single program, but the approach that I used in the practical air brakes materials, which is what has spun off to become CVSA's program as well as your program, was really focusing on what it looks like to the driver, what it looks like from the driver's seat, what are the things that they need, what are the things that they will see, hear, feel, touch, and the things that they are responsible for, and not having brake system schematics, which are often very technical, and it clutters the learner's mind when you put those things in front of them and suggest that they need to sort of appreciate what what is going on in the system. So we often have those kinds of things as an appendix and at the end for those that are further interested. But we start off with, really what does it look like and feel like, and focusing on the driver, those things that are within their realm of understanding, their ability to access and recognize when something is defective or working properly.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like one of the main places where drivers fall down is not really understanding sort of the components of the system, how they work together in the context of what they're actually responsible for, and not knowing really what to do with it. That you did mention that sometimes they're being taught stuff that just isn't accurate anymore. It's the outdated systems. I mean, the technology is improving while the fundamentals may not change a whole lot, the specifics are going to evolve as technology improves. So it seems like there's a real disconnect there in what drivers understand versus like how the whole thing works and what they're responsible for. Do you find that sort of when you're dealing with carriers, when you're talking to other people in the industry, that this is a challenge, is sort of figuring out what they should be telling people?
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, and it's a matter of finding a balance. On the one hand, one school of thought, a lot of people come from a belief that there is a right, a complete air brake system check that you should be doing every day. Um, and it becomes sort of monotonous, a rote sort of thing that they might do, but it takes time. On the other hand, the driver, I think, on the other side, the driver is sitting in that truck, observing what's going on, experiencing what's going on with that truck as they're driving it. And they're going to be able to very quickly establish this is the normal behavior of this vehicle. They have to be able to then interpret that behavior and say, hey, something looks different. Maybe I should do that check. So, again, I don't really ascribe to the detailed step by step, including every safety function of the air brake system as being part of the morning routine of a driver that's going out for the day, because it looks good on paper, but in practice, nobody ever does it. Nobody
Hmm.
is really willing to take the time, pay the drivers the time to do it, and very often you don't find anything. So it's really giving the drivers the awareness of what's normal and abnormal, and then putting an overlay onto that of when things are abnormal, this is when you could be in a compliance situation. And if you're not sure, here's a test that will confirm whether your truck may now be acting abnormally, but it's still in a compliant state, so you're somewhere in between, or it's acting abnormally and you are now in facing a violation if you were to be inspected that way. So
Hmm.
that's a tricky balance.
So that's a really interesting point because it's sort of the traditional train of thought from the most of the safety people is there's a complete test. You do the complete test. You've got to do it exactly the same every day. You've got to spend the time. And you're saying that yeah, like you said, it looks good on paper, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything. So are there things that drivers should be doing every day, or, what would be the scaled down version of that that should be the basic part of it each day?
Well, we're focused on drivers, but what I always include in uh, my putting forward my positions on this is brake compliance starts with the maintenance department.
Hmm.
And drivers have to know, they have to have the confidence that proper maintenance and inspection are being done on their vehicle because you cannot hold, I mean, the driver's the captain of the ship and they have responsibilities associated with that. But there's so many things that the driver cannot determine, cannot be confident about, and they have to rely that the maintenance department has done their thing. So when it comes to things like pushrod stroke, brake adjustment, which is really the most obvious issue, uh, if as a driver you aren't confident that your maintenance people are doing things periodically the way they should be, doing the inspection, confirming that they're doing the repairs properly so that brake adjustment has the best chance of staying compliant all the time, um, then it falls on them to perhaps take that responsibility. And the sad part of it is that when you have maintenance people doing all the things that they need to do properly, drivers almost never find a brake stroke problem and are going to become, as a result of that, complacent. So um, it's really striking that balance and having the dialogue between, the operations and driving staff and the maintenance people to say, do I need to worry about it? And are the maintenance checks being done? I mean, we've introduced it in Canada as part of the annual safety, a much more rigorous approach to checking brake stroke, for example, and recording that on an ongoing basis to draw the attention to it. Those are the kinds of things that drivers can find out about and rely on. Um, the basic checks that they would do on a daily basis can be done fairly quickly. I'm not going to try to list them off the top of my head, but they need to know again those in-depth checks as well, because when something seems off, then definitely they should be doing a more detailed step-by-step test procedure and know what they're looking for.
So, okay, that's interesting. You gave me a whole pile of stuff that I want to dig into. The first is that I just want to kind of underscore the point you just made there is that there really isn't a single thing, sort of a single daily test. There's really a couple of different levels. There's sort of the regular thing that you may be doing on a regular basis, but then there's the extra that you do when you find that something is off or something seems off. And I think that's a great concept for people to get in their heads is that it isn't just these eight things every day without thinking, without any real consideration. It has to flow with the situation and the context. So there may be something that's more basic in the beginning, and then you may go to a higher level depending on the conditions. That's a really good thing for people to start thinking about is the sort of multiple levels of each of these tests. And then the second thing that you were just talking about there, which I thought was really interesting, you said it sort of starts with maintenance, starts with drivers having the confidence that maintenance is actually doing things. This is a really good point because drivers end up being the ones that are sort of they're kind of the canary in the coal mine, or maybe it's the opposite end of it, but everything ends up on the driver. So the driver is the one who's put out of service roadside because there's a problem with the brakes. But as you're saying, it really means that there's a problem with maintenance and there's a problem with operations and all kinds of other things that are happening. So I think that's worth sort of exploring a little bit more is the responsibility there. What are drivers responsible for versus what is maintenance responsible for, operations? This is not always an issue with the driver who's not doing things properly. Yeah, they should be catching things and flagging it, but if it doesn't get repaired, then it ultimately, even though it's the driver who is out of service, it's ultimately somebody else's problem or somebody else's responsibility that has created that issue. So I like the idea of companies starting to think about who's actually responsible for these things and having a discussion about it, making sure that everybody is working together on it, because a lot of times they don't. They just sort of dump it down to the driver. And like you say, like the driver can't necessarily do all of these things. They can't fix everything. So,
Yeah, yeah. I think it's each situation, is different in terms of each fleet setting and where the drivers are working. But I regularly advise trucking companies, operations, and safety and compliance folks. Every brake violation that you find is appearing on your fleet's record should cause you to do a quick background check. What was the defect? Every defect should be viewed as a failure of the system somewhere, and they need to take that information and analyze what can be done. Is it a long-term series of steps that led to this defect appearing? Brake adjustment tends to be one of those long-term things. It doesn't go suddenly from working 100% normally and all of a sudden it's now out of compliance. There's usually a gradual process. And again, that you drag in the maintenance folks. If you've got a sudden leaking hose, yeah, that can happen. And maybe that's something that you can look at. Was it installed improperly? Was it routed improperly? Is it rubbing? And that took a long time and that was missed. Every one of those violations can point to weaknesses in the overall system and rarely are attributable to what the driver has done. So, we put that onus on them because they're out there and they're the ones that are the face of that fleet when they're in that enforcement situation. But generally they have little control over those conditions that led to that point.
yeah, I love that line that every defect should be viewed as a failure of the system. That's yeah, that's a really good way of approaching it. And I'm kind of curious. I wonder if carriers even know what they should be doing. Sort of what's the internal expertise on this? Is it a case of blind leading the blind? Do they really know? Have you seen anything one way or another in your travels across different carriers?
Yeah, I have. And again, moving away from drivers, again, which, obviously we've been trying to say there's others to blame here, but, um, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding about self-adjusting brake adjusters, for example, which are predominant now. Everything has self-adjusting brake adjusters virtually, other than some specialized equipment, heavy haul, and that sort of thing. Some off-road vehicles as well. And they're complacency generators. The maintenance folks say, well, it's there, it's automatic. And if the uh, I don't have to worry about it because it's the driver. The drivers there, they believe that is a driver responsibility, so they don't do their due diligence perhaps. But more importantly, there's a lot of misunderstanding about self-adjusting brake adjusters, what they do, how they work, how long they last. They don't last forever. They are a wearing component and they have a life cycle that maintenance folks need to be aware of. And Mechanics are the kind of person that they like to tweak things, they like to fix things, they like to feel good about it when it goes out the shop. And so you'll often find mechanics that are repositioning those brake adjusters on a regular basis, even thinking that they need to do that and masking the fact that it may be not able to stay in compliance on its own and relying purely on the fact that they're putting it back into proper position whenever they can and hoping that that will work. And what they really need to be doing is confirming, is it doing its job the way that it should? That way, you're not going to get surprised when you're out on the road. Check bring a sample of vehicles in and measure them just the same way they would be at the weigh scales and see what you find. And if you find some that are, close to the compliance limit, that's got to trigger some further look and to say, what can we do about this? Are they aged out? Do they need to be replaced? Is somebody doing something wrong? Are they not properly installed? Those kinds of things all can get drivers and carriers into trouble. And so we really focus on teaching drivers how to check that everything is normal, um, and not what to do about it. That's a separate thing. And the sad thing is that we tell drivers, when you've got a brake adjustment problem, sorry, driver, you can't do anything about it. And we bring a mechanic in, and that mechanic gets his wrench out there and repositions it, which is what they're not supposed to do. And that gets them out of the out of service condition at the weigh scales, and away they go again. They never look at it again, thinking we solved that problem. That's one of the big misconceptions.
Right. Yeah. So that goes back to a great phrase that you had, compliancy generators or complacency generators. Yes, these automatic things, and put that together with maintenance who likes to fix things, but don't always ask whether or not it should need to be fixed. You end up with that situation. Yes, they show up roadside, they fix it, it's now in compliance, and then they stop asking what the issues are. Again, yeah, every defect should be viewed as a break of the system. So these are places where I can see all of those fitting together and becoming a real problem. Yeah, really good
Yeah.
point. Really good point. Um, yeah, yeah. So this is a place where we've got maintenance who likes to fix things, but needs to be stepping back and thinking about whether or not it should need to be fixed. And you were talking before about tracking all of these things on a regular basis, sort of keeping detailed stats on it, because they don't automatically like sort of flip into a violation state overnight. It's a process that gets them to that. And if you're monitoring these things, you can be in much better shape as far as being on top of it and expecting when it gets to this point where it's a problem. So document things, pay attention to it, think about whether or not the process is working. All of those kind of things will be really important. And there was something else that you said that I was just going to ask for. Oh, you're talking about bring people in periodically and just check the status, the same as what would happen roadside or when they go through the scales. So let's talk a little bit about what is that experience roadside? What is enforcement going to be looking for? What's their process going to be there?
Well, I mean, on the CVSA roadside inspection protocols, which are, it's all publicly available. CVSA will tell you how they're going to do their inspection. There are no mysteries about how they do it. And yet we find many mechanics don't practice doing their own checks that way, either because they don't know or because they just believe that, hey, I'm better off just to adjust it. And then I know it's good when it leaves the shop. Um, so, getting back to the survey document, as well as other uh, awareness materials that we've developed. With CVSA, we had a brochure called Stopping Safely. Some of you may remember the series of products that we had, and another one called What's Stopping You, where we outline again, these are the conditions that you need to have the truck in when you check brake adjustment. This is the way you check for, the low air warning operating. This is how you check for air leakage. Those kinds of checks are fairly simple. They're fairly straightforward. And again, if a fleet is in the position of being worried about their compliance exposure, their violation exposure on brakes, there are some things that they can do that would allow them to say, do we have a problem or not, without waiting for the tickets to come in. Do some of the things in the shop or make it part of a preventive maintenance event. While it's in there, let's check these other things, or make it part of some other service activity. Look at those things and see where you're at, and see if that points to, what we said earlier, see if that points to some things where you could improve some of those procedures and make some of those problems go away.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. It's going to do a mock kind of roadside inspection. And I find myself sort of recommending this more and more often. I mean, it came up when we were talking about the English language proficiency, is just do a mock inspection and see how drivers do. And it's kind of the same thing here. Just randomly grab some vehicles and do a mock inspection and see what happens. But I also wonder, sort of related to that, how much time people actually spend on this issue with drivers and with the maintenance team sort of collaboratively looking at it. It's not, in many cases that I've seen, it's not a significant part of driver orientation. It's not really that much part of the onboarding or finishing. And when people do, even when people do kind of the rodeos, or they will bring the group together and do an inspection challenge or something like that, it's often not really given a whole lot of weight. So it seems like something that really is kind of undervalued considering how important it is and how complex it is. Like, I would think that one of the main things that fleets would care about is the ability to stop this vehicle on the road. But I guess that's the complacency that you're talking about. They assume that it's all working fine, and that's good enough. So,
Yeah, I think, that's what we see. If you take the position that it's the onus is on the drivers to make sure that they're out on the road and don't have any brake defects, then it doesn't leave much for the operations and maintenance and safety people then to take responsibility for. And they can do more to support those drivers by looking more closely at this in a systemic way, to say, can we identify either, hey, we're in good shape, we're bulletproof, we're not going to get any violations, we find everything good, or you can identify what those problems are. Don't assume, do some
mhm.
checking.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned earlier some of the myths or misconceptions, and this is one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit as well. There's things that people have some, get some ideas about or assume they know. And there was another one that came up in the one of the documents that you sent, was kind of a top 10 things to be aware of. And there was sort of a myth that you can tell the adjustment by the way it feels when the vehicle stops. And I thought that was really interesting. That's something that comes up commonly, where people say, "Oh, I know I can just tell everything. I don't need to go and check it."
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that in most normal operation of a vehicle with an air brake system, you're using the brakes to about 20%, and that's extreme. I mean, it's often down around 10% of the brake power that it can develop being used to make a normal stop. So um, you're when you're doing the compliance check, you're basically simulating a severe stop situation. What would this brake system do? So you're simulating a high pressure brake application. You're pushing those brakes out to the limit, and there is then the stroke on each brake that cannot be exceeded. It's a very different situation than what you use every day. So if you're waiting until you can feel the change in your everyday stopping, you're going to do very poorly on a simulated severe braking situation.
Or when you actually get in trouble and need those. you're going to be in
That
trouble.
would be the severe braking situation. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or in a compliance check, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Are there other kind of common myths or misconceptions that you see people coming up with regularly?
Yeah, there's another one that's there's a couple that are problematic. One in particular is this belief that with the self-adjusting brake adjusters, the automatic brake adjusters, a number of different ways that they're described, that by making regular hard brake applications, you're actually um, helping them to work properly. Or, take that one step further, that unless you're making regular hard brake applications, they won't work properly. That's a huge myth. Um, you talk to Kerry Rakowski over at CVSA, who runs their inspection programs, and the ask the officers that are roadside, how often, when they have a situation where they've got a truck with excessive pushrod stroke, and the driver says, "Oh yeah, I heard that if I do this, a 6 pack or a 12 pack, or make several hard brake applications, that's how I bring them back into adjustment." Okay, knock yourself out, try it. And they have not once yet seen a case where that changed the truck from being non-compliant to compliant. Now that's an extreme case, but this idea that you're making a difference by making a hard brake application is completely contrary to the operation of 95% of the automatic brake adjusters that are out there, which are sensing the clearance between the brake shoe and the brake drum. And when that changes, which is what causes is the clearance changing is a factor of the brake lining wearing and increasing that clearance, which then allows the mechanism to adjust and tighten that clearance up again. That's where the action is taking place. And once you make those brake shoes touch the brake drum and now add more air pressure to that brake chamber and press even harder on that brake, it doesn't do anything. So and there are people that work for manufacturers of brake components that still uh, parrot that, 6 pack to go. Just forget about it. It doesn't do anything. It's not necessary. Normal driving, the brakes will adjust normally. Another myth that comes up more often is the issue of the 90-degree angle between the slack adjuster and the push rod. And yes, theoretically, geometrically, the angle can affect the amount of force that's generated, and it would be maximum when in fact it's at a 90-degree angle. But the architecture of many vehicles means that the brakes rarely operate close to that 90-degree angle. They could be higher or lower, depending on how you position the angle. But again, you're using so much more, you have so much more brake capability than what you normally use, that that difference in force on that angle is immaterial. And the design of the geometry of those components requires it to fit into a certain envelope. So the angle may be something different than 90. You cannot say, well, if it's at 90, I know it's okay. Under what pressure? Under what amount of what conditions are you looking for that? So it creates confusion, and we got to avoid confusion. We got to keep it simple so that the drivers will get it.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, all of these things, and I can kind of see there's sort of it goes back to what we were talking about early on about the sort of the lack of good documentation, incomplete handbooks, and what happens is you get people talking at truck stops, and you get somebody from a brake manufacturer, and then you get this broken telephone running throughout the industry, and before you know it, it's accepted wisdom that these are the things that have to happen, and they're not correct at all. So yeah, folks, pay attention to those. These are things that people really need to be getting through their heads. And should have said this right off the top, and I can't believe I didn't. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A and pop them in there, and we can go through those as well. Um, yeah, we usually have a open Q&A throughout the thing, and I did not mention that at the beginning. So we've got that available if anybody has questions that they want to ask about any of the stuff that we've been talking about here. Um, there was one other thing that we talked about when we were prepping this that you mentioned, and I wrote it down because I thought it was fantastic, and I thought it'd be really good for everybody here to be thinking about. And you said the four conditions that must exist to do a proper check of pushrod stroke. And I thought, okay, this is something that everybody should be thinking about and is sort of a good thing to be keeping in mind. So, um, can we go through those a little bit? What are those four conditions?
Well, again, those four conditions are included in the CVSA roadside inspection procedures, but basically, you've got to get your air pressure to the right pressure range, 90 to 100
Mhm.
pounds. That's condition one. So that's somewhere below the normal operating pressure range. And yeah, you can do it at the normal operating pressure range, but that increased pressure can hurt you. Uh, uh, More pressure is going to cause the linkage to stretch out more, and you could be beyond the adjustment limit. So 90 to 100 is what is used at roadside. And what that means then is you have to do step two or part two, which is the engine has to be shut off. Otherwise, the pressure will continue to climb while you're doing that. Then the other two conditions are spring brakes released, and the fourth one is service brakes fully applied. It's that simple. So now you've got a static condition. You've got your brakes at that, again, extreme braking sort of simulated extreme braking mode. And you want to ensure that each one of those brake chambers is still within the range that produces maximum brake force. So you are, in a way, simulating a very hot brake situation, an extreme downhill grade. You might have your brakes there, and you want to know for sure that you'll still have full braking force available to bring that vehicle to a stop.
Mhm. And you mentioned sort of going on a steep grade. Does the angle of the vehicle play into that? Like, should you be checking these things or considering the angle or any other physical conditions where you have the vehicle when you're doing this stuff?
No, it's immaterial. I mean, most of the brake check areas that are designated and provided for that purpose are on a pretty flat level ground, and nobody should be doing brake inspections on anything but level ground. But you put wheel chocks under there and you can release the brakes. You can do that. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. But the brakes will work. The compliance check will be the same even if you're on a slope. Just the risk of you having to pay attention to what you're doing, where you're placing yourself and whatnot becomes much more difficult to manage when there's a risk of the vehicle
Mhm.
rolling. So be careful with that.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about this summer. I did a drive through the mountains and noticed a number of brake check areas. Usually the top of a hill, and there's a fairly large pull out there for trucks to stop and do their brake checks. And I was just thinking about it. It did tend to be pretty flat and sort of level at that spot. But I noticed as I was going by, like I guess going by several of these, sometimes there's a few trucks in there, sometimes there's a lot. Not all of those drivers looked as comfortable as you would think that they would be going through that process, and some of them definitely seem to be kind of roughly going through the motions and not really too sure about what they were doing. But I guess something that I just thought of, and I don't know why it never occurred to me beforehand is what you're at the top and you're doing this brake check. What happens if you don't like what you find? You're at the top of a hill. You don't really have a lot of choices there. It can be really tough.
Yeah, and, again, to follow up on the the things we were talking about earlier about what fleets can do to test their readiness, to test the driver's readiness, to prepare the drivers really, um, in addition to doing spot checks of the condition of vehicles. I think every fleet that has operations that involve mountain terrain, certainly those routes that have those brake check situations, you better have a procedure and a way as part of your driver orientation or driver remedial or otherwise professional development. Simulate a brake check stop in your yard. Pretend you're at the top of this hill. What would you do? So
Hmm.
many times you hear about the guys pull into the brake check. The driver doesn't even get out of the cab of his truck. He pulled in there because the signs told him to, and he knows they really want him to. But do they know what to do? And
Hmm.
do they, in fact, practice it? Absolutely. Fleets should be setting that up in their yard. Make it part of a driver appreciation day. Say, listen, hey, or bring in even some enforcement folks. They'll participate in those kinds of events. Build that dialogue with them and set up some of those kinds of events and give drivers the ability to get comfortable, get that understanding of what actually goes on, and then talk about the scenarios. What does good look like, first of all? What could bad look like? Make sure they understand those things, and then talk about strategies.
Hmm.
If you're at the top of that hill and you're now finding that you've got a number of your brakes that are at the brake adjustment limit, what are you going to do? You sure don't want to go down that hill and bring it to the nearest shop. By the same token, having a mechanic come in there and adjust those and bring them all under the limit, that might not do it either.
Hmm.
Again, because depending on what you're going to run into going down that hill,
Hmm.
you may or may not have the ability to deal with it. I mean,
Yeah.
the ideal situation is you're going to descend every mountain incline, every one of these steep descents, using your gear train only, using your engine brake and gearing down to be able to get down that hill without using the brakes. But if something happens unexpectedly, you will be using those brakes to bring that vehicle to a stop. And you need to know
Hmm.
what's going to happen after that. You've used them once, maybe now they're back out at that limit. You need to check it again as if you were at that same stop at the top of the hill.
Hmm. Yeah, we've got a hand raised. So if you have a question, use the Q&A. We'll be happy to get through that. But I think you make a good point, and it sort of comes back to what we were talking about before about getting more of the company involved in these things. Because this is a place where operations should be involved as well, and understanding in terms of trip planning, what are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with level terrain? Are we dealing with steep grades? Are we dealing with things that we need to make sure that drivers are comfortable with? Maybe there are some drivers that are much more expert on this than others, and we should be routing people appropriately. But I love the idea of bringing it in and bringing everybody together, getting enforcement in there, and mocking it up within the yard. Yeah, another place where fleets should be putting a little bit more effort into it and orientation and the regular ongoing training, those kind of things, and paying people for the time. If you want people to do these things properly, pay them to do it, pay them to get educated and practice. Um,
Yeah, and
so
compare
that,
that to the cost of getting it wrong,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
It's getting it wrong isn't free.
yeah,
Getting it right
yeah,
isn't free either.
yeah, for sure. So the question is about listing the things that should be included. So that's the CVSA. I think that's the CVSA criteria that we'll include a link to in our wrap-up message. And documentation, well, as it happens, documentation for that, I will tell you. Uh, Let me point everybody directly to the trekking store. And if I can actually share, here we have the trekking store, thetrekkingstore.com, and Rolf's Practical Air Brakes Handbook and Study Guide. This is going to give you a lot of the information what you're looking for, documentation for checklists and things like that. That's everything you need to be an expert on this stuff. And we'll include a link to that again when we do our sort of summary for everybody. But it is an excellent resource. And the white paper that we were talking about that goes through sort of the state of the documentation or the state of the industry handbooks and all of that, that is available on the store there as well.
And if
Um,
I could, Mark, that's a free download. That
mhm.
document is listed as a product, but it's a free download along with the Operation Airbrake Survey.
Yeah.
They're PDF files. You just click through there,
Hmm.
and you'll get the PDF file sent to you at no charge.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, now the questions are coming in. Okay. Can drivers see an out of adjustment push rod? Uh, can drivers see that if it's not in adjustment properly? I think so. They should be able to, right?
Absolutely. If they do that check properly, again, they're seeing it because um, they would only see it if they knew how to do the check properly. And if they do the check properly and find out that it is now in an excessive stroke condition, that's a violation.
Hmm.
And again, that's where they need to reach out to their operations and maintenance people to say, I found it. Fortunately, as a driver, I found it and I'm at this location. They can seek advice. If the enforcement officer finds it, which is more often the case, um, it's too late. It's on your record. It's there, and so drivers should be practicing that routine to check it, um, and do that in a place where when there is a problem found, they can solve it through the normal maintenance means.
Hmm. Okay. And sort of a follow-up question, when is a brake pad too thin, quarter inch or some other amount?
Yeah, that's in the CVSA out of service
Yeah.
criteria, as well as in Canada, the maintenance, periodic mandatory vehicle inspection standards, which are used for periodic inspections. They have similar minimum thickness for lining.
Hmm.
And again, let's not have drivers look for lining that's too thin. It's very hard for them to see it. It's very hard for mechanics to see it. And that is purely a maintenance question. And it is one of those long-term wearing components. And doing routine checks of the brake lining thickness as part of preventive maintenance is, that's motherhood and apple pie. That's where you should be doing it. And
Hmm.
drivers should never have to contend with something that slipped through the maintenance cracks and be blamed for it. But unfortunately, if they are on the road with that truck, they will be the one wearing it. That's
Hmm.
who's interacting with the enforcement folks. That's the person that's going to, in fact, uh, be dinged for it.
Yes, so I will use this as an opportunity to plug CVSA, cvsa.org, Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance.org. Great organization. You can all join. There's a membership option for fleets. It's not just for enforcement people. We're members. We get tons of good information from them. Fantastic organization. Um, here's another one. Could you explain more about the non-efficiency of the 6 or 10 pack brake applications? If this is not doing anything, why renowned driving schools teach this and made video to show the process? SGI, Saskatchewan government, also mentions this on their website. Well, I think that's coming back to the myth that you were talking about, right? This has kind of become accepted wisdom that this is doing something, but it's really not, right?
Absolutely. And my answer to that is no offense to those that are posting this trying to do the right thing. The fact is, you've got to consider the source. Do the brake component manufacturers publish anything like that? Do the manufacturers of the self-adjusting brake adjusters or automatic brake adjusters, if you check their service literature, you will not find in there anywhere that this is something that is necessary for their product. And I've asked them directly how they respond to that kind of information being published. And they say, as Marcus said, it comes from that urban legend that just becomes so entrenched that people believe it to be true. If you go to the technical experts, the engineers of these brake components, none of them will tell you to do this.
Yeah. I think that's a good point as well, that I find in general across the industry, I think it doesn't occur to them to go to the source in a lot of cases. But yeah, there's nothing stopping you from going to the brake manufacturer and asking them directly, what should we be doing? How should we be best using the equipment that you have produced? They'll give you answers, right? Go directly to the enforcement people, go directly to the regulators, go directly to the source on as many things as you can, and you'll get much better information. Good question. What is your opinion on brake stroke cheaters?
I think by cheaters, you're talking about brake stroke indicators of some kind. There's a number of different products out there, Brake Check, Tattletale. Anyway, it consists of markers that are put onto the brake linkage to help drivers identify where their stroke is relative to the limit. And I am absolutely a fan of those things. I think they should be mandatory. There is a form of mandatory marking that is in the FMCSRs and generally absent in provincial regulations in Canada, but it is there in the manufacturing standard in Canada. They have to be there, but it is completely inadequate what they have to do, which is something that allows something to show when the brake is out of adjustment only, not how it's doing when it's compliant. But absolutely, if you haven't got brake stroke indicators on your trucks, talk to the manufacturers of those products, the distributors of those products, try some out and train your drivers how to use them. They are great time savers, great confidence builders, and great ways to avoid getting great ways to protect your safety record is what it amounts to.
Mm. Okay, excellent. We're nearly at a time. I'm going to try and burn through a couple more. One quick one. Will this recording be sent to us as well? Yes, we will be. We'll be providing that. You'll get a link to it in the summary message that we wrap up with. And the last one, is the red brake dust okay, or is it an indicator of bad brakes?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was distracted by someone pointing out to me, uh, a PR thing on the six pack promoting it. I'm getting it on both
Yes.
sides.
Is the red brake dust okay, or is it an indicator of bad brakes?
Red
Red
brake
brake dust.
dust.
Red brake dust.
Red brake dust. I've never heard of such a thing. Brake
Ah,
lining material is the same from top to bottom, and when it's down below the minimum thickness, the material is still the same. The dust of brakes would not change. There sometimes are rust stains that are indicative of problems, but very few of those things are associated with brakes.
okay. And I think this is now going to bring us to the end. I know um, we didn't get to all the questions. We will try and get those answered in and include those with the wrap-up message. So, as I said, you'll all get a recording of this. With some links to the white papers and surveys that Rolf has referenced, as well as information on Rolf's site. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you very much, Rolf. This was fantastic information. Fantastic information.
All right, you're welcome, Mark, and thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for having me on this program.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.